Lady of Blood, Countess Bathory. Clandestine entry. During the Christmas season of 1609, perhaps 1610, King Matthias II of Hungary dispatched a party of men to the formidable castle Keszthely. Whispers had reached the royal court, alleging that young women from the surrounding area were being held against their will, or worse, that they had met their deaths within its stone walls. Alarmed by these reports, the king ordered a swift investigation. Author Valentine Penrose, in Elizabeth Bathory, La Comtesse Escalating, translated into English as The Bloody Countess, describes these events, as does the fictionalized account by Andrei Codrescu in The Blood Countess, offering vivid depictions of the time and place. Yet our earliest records come from an 18th century Hungarian history written by Father Laszlo Turoczi, with a monograph published in 1744. A later German publication in 1796, translated and quoted by Sabine Baring-Gould in his 1865 work on global werewolf legends, also contributes to our understanding. The men knew they had to proceed with utmost caution. The mistress of the castle, known for her striking black hair and alabaster skin, was no ordinary noblewoman. She was of royal blood, with powerful connections. Once married to a formidable warrior known as Hungary's Black Hero for his valor in battles against the Turks, she counted among her relatives princes, kings, bishops, and cardinals. Her cousin, Prime Minister Thurzo, led this very party on their stealthy approach to the imposing castle. His involvement granted them a strategic advantage. If she recognized his insignia, she might allow them entry, yet their preference was to remain unnoticed. Elizabeth's uncle, Stephen Bathory, had been king of Poland. If these rumors proved baseless, she could become a dangerous political adversary. But if they were true, the king's men had a solemn duty to put an end to her dark deeds. It was a bitterly cold night, and the men struggled to navigate the rugged terrain, their way lit by only a few flickering torches. Word had spread in the village below that the Countess often held clandestine nocturnal gatherings. Such spectacles, if witnessed, could expose her involvement in sorcery or worse. The locals had long spoken of eerie screams echoing from the castle's heights, of girls gone missing, and of sinister deeds. Yet no one dared to confront the regal Countess, now in her 50s, until this night. The king had been informed that 9 girls from respectable families had vanished, and the Countess was believed to be involved. The raiding party, comprising the Prime Minister, a priest who had lodged the complaint, the local governor, also a relative of the Countess, and several soldiers, was aware of the Countess's rumoured practice of the dark arts. They moved quietly, wary of being spotted by her servants. There was an unspoken fear that they might fall victim to a spell if their presence was detected. As they descended the steep hill toward the castle, they paused to catch their breath and ensure they remained unseen. The castle loomed ahead, its windows largely darkened, but the place was vast, and its occupants could be anywhere within. So far, there was no sign of a guard or any alarm. As they drew nearer, they discovered something unexpected. A heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, as if welcoming them in. Cautiously, they pushed it open and stepped inside. A sudden movement startled them. A cat leapt from the shadows. The men had heard that the Countess used cats as her familiars, perhaps to carry out her sinister bidding. 2 more cats slinked from the darkness, and the priest quickly crossed himself. In total, they counted 6 cats. An ominous sign that would linger in the priest's memory long after this night. It was then, as they advanced further into the castle, that they first encountered the dreadful evidence they had come for. Beyond belief. In the cold, dimly lit great hall, they found a young girl lying on the stone floor. Her skin was pallid, and she was partially clothed. At first, the man wondered if she might simply be asleep or perhaps intoxicated, so they cautiously approached. But even as they drew near, she remained unresponsive. One of the men knelt beside her, touched her arm, and shook his head gravely. She was no longer alive. They gently turned her over, revealing an ashen face that bore the unmistakable signs of someone who had lost a great deal of blood. The rumors they had heard seemed suddenly, terrifyingly real. As they absorbed the shock of this grim discovery, a faint moan broke the silence. Just a few paces away, another girl lay sprawled on the floor, her face turned upward. This one still clung to life. Her body was marked by numerous wounds, and her complexion too was deathly pale, as if drained of blood. The man exchanged troubled looks. It was clear she would not survive long, not even long enough to be carried to the village for help. With heavy hearts, they left her there and pressed on, deeper into the castle, where the smell of decay grew stronger. Their path soon led them to another tragic sight. A woman's body chained to a pillar. She had clearly endured brutal treatment. Her skin bore marks of beatings, burns, and cuts, likely inflicted by a whip. Like the others, she appeared to have lost a significant amount of blood. The scene they were uncovering seemed to point toward a ritualistic element, as though these poor souls had been subjected to some kind of blood ceremony. Unease settled over the party as they realized the gravity of the horrors unfolding before them. Fearing they had seen only the beginning, they descended the stone steps to the castle's lower levels in search of the dungeons. Thurzo, the Prime Minister, had visited this place in his youth and guided them down cold, damp corridors. The men's hearts raced, their breaths shallow as they navigated the winding passages. In the oppressive darkness, the sound of movement caught their attention, along with soft, plaintive cries. The men hurried toward the sound, and what they found confirmed their worst fears. In the prison cells, they discovered women and children, many bearing the scars of repeated injuries. The healthier captives begged for their lives, knowing they had narrowly escaped a dire fate. These women understood all too well that those brought into the castle rarely left with their health intact. On this night, fortune had smiled upon them. The men quickly freed the captives and led them to safety, ensuring they were out of harm's reach before continuing their search for the one responsible for these dreadful deeds. Their journey took them to the upper floors, where, to their shock, some sources suggested they stumbled upon the aftermath of a holiday revel, complete with unspeakable cruelty. The woman they sought had, however, already fled, but they knew where to find her. Distinguishing between fact and fiction in this story, which is more than 3 centuries old, remains challenging. What follows is drawn from multiple sources, though contradictions on key details are frequent and significant. The Lady. There are no surviving written accounts detailing exactly what the king's men discovered that night, as the scene was reportedly too horrific to be committed to the record. However, there was much to recount when the time came for legal proceedings. The officials arrested those involved in the depraved activities, freed the surviving victims, and confined the protesting countess within her own castle while awaiting the decision on her fate. The woman they apprehended was Countess Elizabeth Bathory, a member of one of the most powerful families in Hungary, whose estates lay at the foot of the Carpathian Mountains. As noted by historian Gordon Melton, she was born in 1560 or 1561 to George and Anna Bathory. The Hungary of her time was a land of conflict, beset by battles between the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburgs of Austria. The Bathory family were Protestant, part of a relatively new religious movement, and Elizabeth spent her early years on the estate of Exid in Transylvania. At the tender age of 11, her cousin Stephen became Prince of Transylvania, intent on uniting Europe against the Turks. Yet despite his ambitions, his resources were drained by battles on multiple fronts. Stephen was notorious for his ruthlessness, and some scholars point to him as evidence of a strain of instability in the family. Elizabeth's childhood was far from idyllic despite her noble status. She was prone to fits of rage and unpredictable behaviour, which some have speculated were symptoms of a neurological disorder. Epilepsy had been suggested as a possible cause, while others see her behavior as evidence of a deep-seated aggression. At the age of 14, she became pregnant by a peasant, an indiscretion that led to her being sequestered to avoid scandal before her arranged marriage to an aristocrat. At 15, she wed Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a celebrated warrior who was frequently absent from their home due to military campaigns. Their union brought together two politically powerful families, both infamous for their cruelty. Elizabeth's aunt, a notable figure at court, was rumoured to be both a witch and a woman who engaged in same-sex relations. Her uncle dabbled in alchemy and was said to worship the devil, while her brother was a notorious libertine, with a reputation so sordid that no woman or girl was safe in his presence. Elizabeth's childhood nurse, Lorna Jo, who would be among those arrested in 1610, was reputed to practice dark magic, with rituals said to involve the sacrifice of children. According to True Vampires of History by Donald Glutt, Elizabeth delved deeper into witchcraft as she grew older. It is said that she carried a parchment inscribed with an incantation for protection, though some sources, such as Valentine Penrose, claim this was actually the call of a newborn child. The inscription called upon the deity Istan for protection, health, and longevity. The most curious part of the incantation purportedly read, "When I am in danger, send 99 cats. I order you to do so because you are the supreme commander of cats. Order 99 cats to come with speed and bite the heart of King Matthias, and keep Elizabeth safe from harm." After her marriage, Elizabeth took residence in Castle Sarvar, where she learned the intricate art of managing a vast estate. Her harsh treatment of servants, while legendary today, was not entirely unusual for the aristocracy of the time. Many nobles ruled with an iron hand, meting out severe punishment, even death, to those they deemed beneath them. For Elizabeth, this unchecked power fueled a cruel impulsiveness that only grew stronger in an environment where the nobility faced little accountability. By many counts, Elizabeth was also consumed by vanity. She reportedly changed her clothes several times a day and spent hours gazing at her reflection, admiring her renowned beauty. Her devotion to preserving her alabaster complexion through the use of oils and unguents was well known. No one dared deny her anything, and she demanded constant adoration. What might she have become had her path been different, we can only speculate, but it is certain that her cruel tendencies flourished under the sadistic influence of her husband. Training in torture. Upon marrying Count Ferenc Nadasdy and moving into his castle, Elizabeth was introduced to the darker aspects and methods of discipline. Some accounts, such as that of Valentine Penrose, suggest that Nadasdy merely tolerated Elizabeth's growing cruelty but did not participate in it himself. Others, however, claim he was equally harsh, even teaching his wife a few of his own methods. One infamous technique attributed to him involved covering a servant girl in honey and leaving her tied outside for insects and bees to torment. Another, far more chilling method involved pouring water over a girl during the winter, freezing her to death in the harsh cold. There are also stories that he sent spells from distant lands during his military campaigns, gifts for his wife to experiment with at home. His encouragement of Elizabeth's brutal tendencies reportedly extended to showing her how to beat the serving girls to the brink of death, a task she allegedly relished. While Nadasdy was often away at war, Elizabeth spent her time refining her own cruel rituals and even wrote to her husband about them. According to Donald Glutt, in one such letter, Elizabeth described a new ritual taught to her. "Thurko has taught me a lovely new one. Catch a black hen and beat it to death with a white cane. Keep the blood and smear some on your enemy. If you cannot reach him, smear it on one of his garments." Elizabeth's personal life was as complex as her dark practices. Like her notorious aunt, Elizabeth was said to indulge in relationships with both men and women. She surrounded herself with individuals versed in sorcery, alchemy, and witchcraft. One such figure, described as a nobleman with pale skin and long dark hair, was reputed to have knowledge of blood rituals. Glut, possibly drawing from later vampire myths, speculated that this man was brought to the castle to teach Elizabeth about blood drinking. Some suggest this mysterious figure might have been a woman in disguise, though these stories verge on legend rather than verified fact. Elizabeth's involvement with this individual reportedly ended abruptly, with her returning alone and, according to some accounts, bearing traces of blood on her lips, though official records do not substantiate this claim. Despite her dark activities, Elizabeth and Nadasdy had 4 children together, 3 boys and a girl. In 1601, Nadasdy fell seriously ill and was bedridden until his death in 1604, leaving Elizabeth a widow at the age of 44. Some speculate that she may have played a role in hastening his demise, though this remains unproven. Following his death, Elizabeth relocated to Vienna, where she engaged in more active social circles. Yet her return to Hungary allowed her greater privacy for what had become increasingly frequent torture sessions. Historian Gordon Melton notes that Elizabeth was not alone in her cruel pursuits. One of her closest accomplices until 1609 was Anna Durvalia, and later, Ursi Mayarova, a widow who is said to have encouraged Elizabeth to begin abducting young girls from the lower nobility. Soon, pretty young women and even children from villages far and wide began to disappear. Families were powerless to act, as speaking out against a noble woman of Elizabeth's stature could lead to severe repercussions. Although they saw the Nadasdy carriage, drawn by black horses, passing through the night with girls inside who never returned, they could do little but turn to their priests for comfort. The memory of the brutal suppression of a peasant uprising in 1524 was still fresh in their minds, and no one dared risk challenging the nobility. According to German anthropologist Michael Wagner, Elizabeth's cruelty only intensified after her husband's death. Many young women were lured to the castle with promises of employment, only to be imprisoned and subjected to horrific treatment. These unfortunate girls were beaten until their bodies were swollen and bruised. Elizabeth herself was said to have taken part in these acts, sometimes changing the girls' blood-soaked clothes before continuing the torment. The methods of torture grew more sadistic, with the victims sometimes burned or cut with razors, and many were ultimately beaten to death. It was said, when Elizabeth was done with them, a mop and bucket was needed to take care of what was left. Over time, Elizabeth's mental state appeared to deteriorate, with many accounts suggesting she suffered from severe psychosis, worsened by age and isolation. Some of the more disturbing allegations were revealed during later legal proceedings. Historian R.E. Everett recounts that Elizabeth would at times sew a servant girl's mouth shut, force her to consume pieces of her own flesh, or burn her in ways too graphic to describe fully here. Wagner adds that Elizabeth was known to insert needles into the flesh of those who accompanied her on carriage rides, particularly if they were women. There is a grim legend from the trial, though likely exaggerated under the duress of torture, that Elizabeth, when bedridden, would bite those who came near her like a wild animal. Addiction. Eventually, the supply of peasant girls dwindled, and Elizabeth, emboldened by her past impunity, turned her bloodlust toward the daughters of lesser aristocrats. Like many who engage in increasingly reckless behavior, her arrogance blinded her to the dangers. She had acted without consequence for so long that she believed herself untouchable. The thrill of testing boundaries and seeing what she could get away with only fueled her audacity. It seemed that she had become so deeply enthralled by the pleasures of her cruelty that stopping was no longer an option. Sabine Baring-Gould, the esteemed 19th century English author and folklorist, used Elizabeth's story to illustrate the psychological phenomenon he observed in his own time. In his 1865 work, he recounted witnessing an accomplished young woman of considerable refinement and of a highly strung nervous temperament stringing flies onto a needle, watching their suffering with a strange sense of detachment. Cruelty may remain latent, he wrote, until, by some accident, it is aroused, and then it will break forth in a devouring flame. Baring Gould compared this dormant cruelty to the passion for blood, suggesting that it can rage with unexpected violence when awakened. We have no conception of the violence with which they can rage till circumstances occur which call them into action. Passion blazes forth, and the serenity of the quiet beast is shattered forever. A word, a glance, a touch are sufficient to fire the magazine of passion in the heart, and to desolate forever an existence. He warned that the thirst for blood, like cruelty, may reside even within those closest to us, hidden until the right circumstance bring it to light. It may smoulder in the bosom which is most cherished by us, Baring Gould mused, and we may be perfectly unconscious of its existence there, though moral principles may keep such desires in check for some. In others, these restraints can be easily broken. To replenish her dwindling supply of victims, Elizabeth began offering lessons in social graces to young noblewomen. When they arrived at her castle, she had her choice among them. However, it was the murder of one such young lady in 1609 that finally drew the attention of the authorities. Elizabeth attempted to stage the girl's death as a suicide, but this incident, combined with years of troubling rumours, prompted a decisive response. The king, who had borrowed a substantial sum from Elizabeth's husband, was eager to support an investigation. If she were found guilty and arrested, his debt to her would be wiped clean. Thus, with the weight of the monarchy behind it, the investigation moved forward. For all involved, it seemed like a winning outcome. Everyone, that is, except for Elizabeth. Judgment Day. The rumours were indeed true, and what was uncovered was far worse. The reign of terror orchestrated by Elizabeth Bathory was finally brought to an end. On the night of the raid, her cousin, Prime Minister Thurzo, locked her within her own fortress and left a contingent of men to guard her. In his letters, Thurzo mentioned finding only a single corpse, the body of a young woman who had been accused of stealing a pear. Her hands had been burned, and there were bite marks on her body. Thurzo later claimed to have seen no evidence of the more scandalous orgies that had been rumoured. But as Elizabeth's relative, he had ample reason to protect the family's reputation. Others, however, recounted a far more dramatic and grisly scene, particularly in the aftermath. As Elizabeth awaited her trial, officials scoured her castle for further evidence. What they uncovered was nothing short of horrifying. Bones and other human remains were found scattered throughout the grounds, along with the clothing and personal effects of numerous missing girls. One of Thurzo's lieutenants is quoted in Andrei Codrescu's account, recalling the nightmarish discoveries. The lieutenant wrote of dead bodies strewn about the castle, many of the girls dismembered, their arms and eyes missing. One body, blackened but not fully burned, was found in the fireplace. Even more chilling, shallow graves dotted the area around the castle, and dogs roamed about, carrying parts of the deceased in their mouths. Much of what was learned came from the survivors, those who had miraculously escaped Elizabeth's cruelty, as well as the confessions of her accomplices. The men and women who had assisted her in those heinous acts scrambled to secure clemency by cooperating with the authorities, hoping to avoid further torture or harsher punishments. Elizabeth herself, however, did not attend the trial and refused to testify. She remained in her castle, steadfastly maintaining her innocence. Some accounts, such as that of historian R.E. Everett, suggest that Elizabeth's high-born relatives persuaded the court to place her under house arrest indefinitely, avoiding the public humiliation of a formal sentence. On January 2nd, 1611, a special tribunal convened, with 21 judges presiding over the proceedings. On January 2nd, 1611, a special tribunal convened, with 21 judges presiding over the proceedings. The trial was led by Judge Theodosius Tisulo of the Royal Supreme Court. Over the course of the hearings, the tribunal called numerous witnesses, sometimes as many as 35 per day. These witnesses included families of the missing girls and victims who had survived their ordeal. One particularly heart-wrenching testimony came from a mother who had lost her 10-year-old daughter to Elizabeth's atrocities. The most damning testimony came from Elizabeth's own servants and accomplices, who provided detailed accounts of the crimes committed within the castle. As Valentine Penrose recounts, each accomplice was asked the same 11 questions regarding their time at the castle and their involvement in the crimes. They were pressed to describe how many girls had been murdered, who the victims were, where they had come from, and who had brought them to the castle. In addition, they were asked to recount the specific methods of torture used, what had happened to those who had died, and, most importantly, the role of the Countess in these horrific acts. The testimonies revealed a series of brutal practices so vile that Elizabeth Bathory remains infamous to this day as one of history's most monstrous figures. Testimony of the torturers. Among those who testified against Elizabeth Bathory was Fixo, a dwarf who had been in her service for 16 years. He claimed that he had been brought to the castle against his will and was uncertain about the number of women he had helped kill, but he did recall the number of girls, 37. He described how 5 had been buried in shallow holes, 2 in a garden, and 2 more at night in a churchyard, among other grim details. These girls had been lured to the castle with promises of employment, and in some cases, women from nearby villages even conspired to provide young girls in exchange for money or small gifts. If the girls did not come willingly, they were beaten into unconsciousness and carried off. Once at the castle, they were bound and subjected to cruel treatment, including being stabbed with needles and scissors. They had been chosen for their youthful beauty and the softness of their skin, which made them appealing to Elizabeth's twisted desires. When asked to describe the type of torture used, Fixco revealed horrific details. According to Valentine Penrose, he testified, they tied their arms and hands very tightly with Viennese cord. They were beaten until the whole body was black as charcoal, their skin rent and torn. One unfortunate girl, he recalled, endured more than 200 blows before finally succumbing. Dorco, another accomplice and procurer, was said to have cut the girl's fingers one by one with shears before slitting their veins with scissors. Elizabeth's childhood nurse, Lorna Dew, also confessed her role in the murders, admitting that she had personally killed around 50 victims. She described using red-hot pokers to inflict severe injuries, sometimes forcing the heated metal into the mouths or noses of the girls. According to Jo, Elizabeth herself enjoyed placing her fingers into a victim's mouth and pulling hard until the sides of their mouths tore. She would also stab the girls repeatedly with needles or tear open their flesh with pincers. One of her favorite tortures was slitting open the skin between the girls' fingers. Elizabeth's cruelty knew no bounds. She was known to administer arbitrary and brutal beatings, often to the point of disfigurement. She might cut off a victim's fingers or strike her face until the bones shattered. Even when ill, she refused to stop. Instead, the Countess had girls brought to her bedside, where she would slap and bite them, sometimes with fatal results. It was said that she even forced her male servants to consume parts of the victims' bodies. According to Lorna Jo, Elizabeth would sometimes place oiled paper between a girl's legs and set it alight, or use candles to burn them. There was often so much blood from these acts that cinders were placed around Elizabeth's bed to absorb it. Afterward, the bodies were secretly buried, with chants whispered over them. Other accomplices testified to additional atrocities. One mentioned the use of a red-hot iron applied to the soles of the victim's feet, while another witness described seeing 4 girls bound in shrouds, barely alive and unable to move. A particularly bizarre testimony came from someone who claimed to have seen the devil himself sitting on Elizabeth's lap, further suggesting she may have been entirely under his spell, an accusation steeped in superstition and fear. The judges also heard testimony regarding the kidnapped girls who had been chained to the walls of the dungeon. These unfortunate souls were fattened up, as Elizabeth believed this would increase the blood in their bodies, which she deemed essential for her nighttime rituals. Some were forced into degrading acts, and those who resisted were tortured or killed. Yet even those who complied were not spared. Depending on Elizabeth's whims, her favourite girls could receive the harshest treatment, and some were forced to commit acts of self-mutilation. A few were even confined in small, spike-filled cages. Even in an era when torture was not uncommon, the judges were appalled by the stories of cruelty they heard, particularly from survivors who described how they had been pierced, pinched, beaten, and burned by the Countess herself. Many of these survivors bore lifelong disfigurements as a result of their ordeals. As the hearing progressed, the accounts grew more horrific, with witness after witness recounting the number of bodies they had seen and the brutal manner in which these victims had been treated. Ultimately, Elizabeth Bathory and her accomplices were convicted of 80 murders based on skeletal remains, body parts, and witness testimony. During the trial, a newly discovered ledger, allegedly in Elizabeth's own handwriting, was introduced as evidence. This ledger reportedly contained the names and details of more than 650 females, suggesting that the true number of her victims could have been much higher. Although this figure was never officially confirmed, some, including Penrose, suggest that King Matthias himself wrote to Thurzo during the hearing, mentioning that he believed the number of victims to be at least 300. Disposition. While Elizabeth Bathory's accomplices faced harsh punishments, some had their fingers pulled off, others were buried alive, and some were beheaded. The fate of the Countess herself was more complicated. King Matthias favoured execution, but carrying out such a sentence would have required enacting a special statute to strip her of her royal immunity. A similar statute had already been passed just to bring her to trial. Prime Minister Thurzo, her relative, intervened, arguing that Elizabeth was not fully aware of the gravity of her actions. Yet the court report detailed the numerous torture devices found in her residence, which indicated not only a clear understanding, but also a perverse enjoyment of her actions. Despite the king's wishes, there was considerable pressure to preserve Elizabeth's wealth within the family. In the end, she was spared the death penalty and instead sentenced to a life imprisonment, though without any formal sentencing procedure. She was confined to a small set of rooms within her own castle at Accomplices. Her son and sole heir wrote a letter pleading for mercy on her behalf, but her daughter Anna severed ties entirely, vowing never to speak to her mother again or allow her own children to have contact with her. Throughout her confinement, Elizabeth maintained her innocence, claiming that the peasant girls had died from various natural causes such as contagious diseases or blood poisoning, and that she could not be held responsible for such misfortunes. Her imprisonment was harsh. The entrances and windows of her chambers were sealed with brick, leaving only small slits through which food and air could pass. According to Valentine Penrose, Elizabeth was devastated that she no longer had access to her magic incantations, which she believed had protected her. After just 3.5 years of confinement, in the summer of 1614, Elizabeth died at the age of 54. Her death was discovered when a servant peering through the slit of the door saw that her dinner had gone untouched, and Elizabeth was found lying face down on the floor. When the walls were torn down to retrieve her body, legend has it that a brief document was found among her belongings. It supposedly revealed that before her imprisonment, Elizabeth had invoked a dark power, calling upon 99 cats to tear out the hearts of her accusers and judges. The priest who read the document reportedly recalled the cats that had been seen prowling the castle on the night of her arrest. For the record, what stands out about Countess Elizabeth Bathory is that she is one of the most extremely rare women in history associated with vampiric or cannibalistic behaviors. After her death, rumors began to swirl about her supposedly bathing in the blood of her young victims. Historian R.E. Everett made this claim quite emphatically, though without substantial evidence, attributing her actions to a fixation on eternal youth, and many writers have since followed this narrative. However, when Dracula scholar Raymond McNally travelled to Slovakia to examine court records, he found no mention of Elizabeth bathing in blood. Some records did, however, detail her violent tendencies, including accounts of her biting pieces of flesh from her victims. Father Laszlo Turoczi, in his 1744 historical account of Hungary, written more than a century after Elizabeth's death, attempted to piece her story together using official records, local legend, and folklore. Yet his work must be viewed with caution, as the Catholic Church, during a time of werewolf and witch hunts, often encouraged sensationalist tales that aligned with its doctrines about the battle between God and Satan. One enduring legend surrounding Elizabeth is that she once slapped a servant girl, drawing blood, and upon washing the blood from her hand, found that the skin appeared more youthful there. According to the story, alchemists assured her that this was a sign of her noble bloodline. To preserve her fading beauty, Elizabeth allegedly began bathing in the blood of virgins. This idea was further popularized in 1795 by Wagner, whose account was later translated by Sabine Baring-Gould. Wagner wrote, "Elizabeth was wont to dress well in order to please her husband, and she spent half the day at her toilette. On one occasion, a lady's maid noticed something wrong with her headdress, and as recompense for pointing it out, received such a severe box on the ears that blood gushed from her nose and spurted onto her mistress's face. When the blood was washed away, the skin where it had touched appeared more beautiful, whiter, and more translucent." According to this legend, Elizabeth then resolved to bathe her face and body in human blood to enhance her beauty. Her accomplices were said to collect the blood in a tub so she could bathe at 4 o'clock in the morning, after which she allegedly emerged more beautiful than before. Despite the persistence of these tales, no official record mentions such bizarre practices or fetishes. It is far more likely that Elizabeth derived a sadistic pleasure from the sight of blood, using it as part of her rituals rather than for rejuvenation. Still, if the infamous ledger with the names of over 650 girls is genuine, then Elizabeth's victim count remains unparalleled in history. Her legacy endures as one of the most bloodthirsty killers ever recorded, her noble status shielding her for years in a society that protected its aristocrats. Current notions. In The Vampire Companion, Gordon Moulton notes that no testimony during Elizabeth Bathory's trial mentioned her supposed habit of bathing in the blood of her victims. No witness raised the issue, nor was it reported at the time. However, the trial records were sealed to prevent embarrassment to the Hungarian aristocracy, and Elizabeth's name was not to be spoken publicly within aristocratic circles. It wasn't until a century later that Laszlo Turoczi gathered both documents and folklore related to Bathory and recorded them in his historical account. According to Melton, it was Turoczi who first suggested the Countess's infamous blood-bathing habits, though Valentine Penrose claims these details came from contemporary records. Turoczi's work was published during a time when Europe was gripped by widespread fear of vampires, so it is difficult to determine how much of the tale was embellished by popular superstition. Although Elizabeth appears frequently in vampire lore, there is no evidence that she actually drank the blood. Despite this, Penrose and others have frequently referred to her as a vampire in their writings, and her legend has been immortalized in fiction and film as such. In the 1980s, Raymond McNally published Dracula Was a Woman, in search of the Blood Countess of Transylvania, in which he suggested that Bram Stoker, author of Dracula, had encountered Elizabeth's story in Sabine Baring-Gould's 1865 book, The Book of Werewolves, which linked her to werewolf legends. McNally proposed that Elizabeth's alleged obsession with blood and youth may have inspired Stoker's portrayal of Dracula, particularly in the way blood rejuvenates the vampire, keeping him youthful. He also speculated that the character of Renfield, the Life Eater in Dracula, may have been partially based on Elizabeth's legend. Bathory's legend certainly played a role in the creation of the character of Count Dracula, McNally wrote. However, this theory is strongly contested by scholar Elizabeth Miller. In Dracula, Sense and Nonsense, Miller dismisses McNally's claims, calling them rubbish. She argues that while a brief mention of Bathory appears in Baring Gould's text, there is no evidence that Stoker was influenced by it or that he even read it. According to Miller, the notion that Bathory influenced Dracula stems from works published in the 1970s, particularly Gabriel Ronet's 1972 book, The Dracula Myth, and Donald Gluck's 1971 True Vampires of History. Miller insists that just because Bathory was mentioned in one of Stoker's possible sources does not mean he read or was influenced by it. Having reviewed Stoker's notes herself, Miller maintains that McNally's assertion is incorrect. More likely, she argues, Stoker was influenced by Baring Gould's general association between vampires and werewolves, not Bathory specifically. Whether Elizabeth Bathory drank or bathed in blood, was obsessed with youth, or targeted young women for their skin, there is no doubt that she was a bloodthirsty tyrant. Even in an era when aristocrats were rarely held accountable for their actions, the evidence against her is overwhelming. Discounting the more sensational tales obtained through torture, the numerous reports of missing girls, the testimony of surviving victims, and the discovery of human remains, all point to her role in extreme torture and serial murder. Let us know what part you think she played in the comments, and thank you for joining us.